So hi everyone, welcome to the SciML webinar. We're kicking off our fall series today. We've moved to the University of Michigan, so we're very grateful to the MICDE for hosting us so that we can continue doing the SciML webinar. We have a lot of exciting speakers to come. A lot of our Zoom links and website links have changed, so I'll try and update those as much as possible. Our first talk of the series is going to be given by David Ruhe, and the session chair is Eric Beckers. So I'll introduce Eric. So Professor Eric Beckers is an assistant professor in geometric deep learning in the machine learning lab at the University of Amsterdam. Before this, he did a postdoc in applied differential geometry at the Department of Applied Mathematics at the Technical University of Eindhoven. In his PhD, in biomedical engineering, he developed medical image analysis algorithms based on sub-Riemannian geometry in the Lie group SE2, using the same mathematical principles that underlie mathematical models of human visual perception. Such mathematics find their application in machine learning, where through symmetries and geometric structure, robust and efficient representation learning methods are obtained. His current work is on generalizations of group convolutional neural networks and improvements of computational and representation efficiency through sparse, adaptive, and geometric learning mechanisms. He's a recipient of the MICC Young Scientist Award in 2018, Phillips Impact Award in 2018, and a VENI Personal Research Grant. Eric is recognized as an ELIS Scholar and ELIS Program for Geometric Deep Learning. We're grateful to have you, Eric, and I'll pass it on to you.
All right, thank you so much for this introduction, and I'm very excited about this talk by David. So let me in turn introduce David Ruhe and also say a bit about the environment in which he's working. So David Ruhe is one of our PhD students in the Amsterdam Machine Learning Lab, and maybe as some of you know, like one of the main pillars in AmLab is geometric deep learning, and with applications. So we have also a lab focusing on AI for science and scientific discovery. And it's an intersection of AI for science and geometric deep learning where David Ruhe's work takes place. So he's currently a fourth-year PhD student and has produced several very interesting papers on this direction. And what I'm very excited about is, well, all of this Clifford group equivariant neural networks, because I think when you look at geometric deep learning from the equivariance perspective, we've mostly been focusing on rigid body motions or SE3 or SE2 transformations. And those seem to have been worked out pretty neatly. And what we learned from all this geometric deep learning is that internal geometric structure is super important. And now, well, we've explored some tools for SO3, SE3 equivariance. And what David did in his latest work is actually dive deeper into what kind of algebraic tools can we use such that neural networks can handle geometry in an appropriate way. So I guess, David, this is what you're going to teach us today. I'm very proud of this work. I'm very happy that you sort of continue this line of geometric deep learning within the AmLab with Amsterdam machine learning context. And I'm very much looking forward to your talk.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that great introduction, and thanks to Keith for inviting us here. So let's dive right into it. The paper I'm going to discuss is called Clifford Group Equivariant Neural Networks. This is work done recently with Johannes Brandstetter at Microsoft Research, AI for Science, and my PhD supervisor, Patrick Faure. Equivariant neural networks, some of you might be familiar, but let's do a quick recap to get everyone on the same page. In this work, we consider graph geometric settings in which your data can be modeled using a graph. And the classic example is a molecule. And we take this molecule, we embed it in some geometric space, and we want to apply some kind of transformation to it. And that's denoted with phi here. And then, of course, the way that I presented this molecule in the first place is completely arbitrary, right? So I could have also shown it to you with a different kind of orientation. And then our model's behavior should not completely break down. You can also imagine at test time, you get the same molecule as in your trained data set, and your prediction should not break down. And enforcing that your model respects these kind of geometric symmetries is what equivariant neural networks do. And from a group theoretic perspective, what we say is that if we take an element from a certain group, symmetry group, then applying our model and then applying let's say a rotation, as shown here, should give the same result as rotating the molecule first and then applying our model. And this diagram kind of shows that. So we go either this direction or this direction, and we should end up in the same place. And this stimulates robust and reliable results, as you can imagine. Now, there's a nice kind of categorization we can make about the different flavors of equivariant neural networks. The first one uses regular representations of the group, and they what they do is they do group convolutions involving an integral over a group. And a famous example of this is the CNN, the convolutional neural network. There they are famously translation equivariant, meaning that if we slide our image or move our image, then the representations that the convolutional neural network learns or has, they also shift. But you can imagine that so for translations, this is very we can implement this very efficiently. For rotations and all possible rotations in 3D, for example, this becomes harder and harder to integrate over all these group elements. The second category you would call scalarization methods, and these are quite popular because they are quite efficient, like EGNN, for example, is a famous example. But they operate either only using invariant features that do not, that are unaffected by, let's say, a rotation, or they only update vector valued information using scalar multiplication, so only scaling vectors. And this can restrict their expressivity. And the final category of these equivariant neural networks are steerable methods, like tensor field networks. What they do is you can take tensor products of your features, and then the representations of a group acting on these, they're Wigner-D representations. You have to decompose them into irreps. And the solution to this decomposition into irreps is given by the Clebsch-Gordon coefficients. And finding this solution for any space of any dimension is not trivial. You have to solve for all these different kinds of spaces. So that's the downside of those. And as a quick teaser of what we have done is we looked at the Clifford algebra, also known as the geometric algebra, and we operate on what you call multivectors. They are elements of this algebra. One is displayed here, and they are these composite objects consisting of scalar parts, vector parts, but also these interesting bivector and trivector parts. Now we have a group representation acting on these multivectors. So you can see that we have rotated this multivector here, but we also have neural networks that can operate on these multivectors in a way that this commutative diagram closes, getting the equivariance result. So this is a quick overview. I'm going to introduce what this Clifford algebra actually is. So to do so, we have to start with bilinear forms. So geometry, if you want to do geometry, you have to start with some notion of distance. And to do so, we introduce a bilinear form, which is a function that takes two vectors and spits out a scalar. And after introducing this, you can now compute distances between two vectors given by this inner product here, for example, or angles, all the things that you might recognize from usual linear algebra. And as a quick side note, this already introduces some symmetry, because if we now have this bilinear form, then the group of all the linear transformations that preserve this bilinear form, that leave this bilinear form intact, that's the orthogonal group. And some examples of elements in this group are reflections and rotations. So what it means in practice is, if we take the length of a certain vector and then rotating, that vector leaves its length intact, of course. So if we take any 2 points in this snowflake, then reflecting it leaves the distance between these 2 points intact. Now, this notion generalizes to non-Euclidean metrics as well, for example, in special relativity. So an inner product in the Euclidean case might look like this. We take this vector matrix product, or this quadratic form here, where as a metric, this matrix in between, that's just the identity. So in the Euclidean case, we are not usually very concerned about the metric. But if we go to special relativity, this changes, because the metric would look something like this, where we now have 1 positive entry and 3 negative entries. And yeah, this metric, how you define it, it basically defines the type of geometry that you're dealing with. And the orthogonal group of such a space, of this space, is written O13, because we have 1 positive entry and 3 negative entries in our metric. But the definition is exactly the same as the Euclidean case, meaning that it consists of all elements that leave this bilinear form intact. Okay, so that was a quick side note that we'll use later in the presentation. Back to the Clifford algebra. So it's also known as the geometric algebra, because it is an algebra, which is a mathematical object that relates to geometry. So an algebra is a vector space, for example, R3, that you equip with a product. That means that you can now take 2 vectors and write down U times V, which is not a thing you can do in usual linear algebra, of course, where we manipulate vectors through matrices. But now this is a valid expression. But it doesn't mean a lot yet. And to give it meaning, we have to somehow connect this product to the geometry. So we have to specify what this product looks like, such that it somehow relates to the geometry of this vector space. And of course, you can take inner products, which is a valid product, but it always reduces to a scalar, which is not so interesting. So we want some kind of product that doesn't necessarily give you a scalar, but still it involves the geometry somehow. And to do so, we axiomatically state that whenever we square vectors, so we say, so V times itself, we put that to be its squared length, which is shown here. And by enforcing this relation, we always have a way to connect the algebra to the geometry. And from this definition, we can now also derive other interesting equations. For example, we can look at U plus V squared. And then using the rules of products, we can just distribute, right? And then I'm not showing it here, but if you then identify these squares here with the bilinear form as shown here, and use the rules of bilinearity, then you will see that UV plus VU equals 2 times the bilinear form. And this is now another way to relate to the geometry. So here we had a vector squared should give its length. Here we now have a way to have an expression that connects 2 vectors to their inner product, which relates to their angle and so on. So this is how we start from geometry and derive more and more kind of relationships in an algebraic way. But we haven't looked yet at where these individual products live, this u times v and this v times u. So let's have a look at that. We see that u times v can be rewritten like by subtracting and adding vu over 2. We get these two terms. And by using the relationship that we saw before on the previous slide, we see that uv plus vu over 2 is the inner product between them. So multiplying two vectors gives, on one hand, it gives their inner product. On the other hand, we have this uv minus vu over 2. And it turns out that this is, if you're familiar with the exterior algebra, this is the wedge product. And the wedge product is an anti-commutative product that, for example, computes the area of the parallelogram that these two vectors define. And I will give more intuition about this later on. But yeah, if you're familiar with the wedge product, then we get, then it might mean something to you. Now this wedge product, yeah, it's already illustrated here. So u wedge v computes an assigned area between these two vectors u and v. And the order of the operation matters in the sense that if we compute v wedge u, then you get the same result, but with a minus sign because you went the other way around. So it's an oriented area. And like I said, if we'll look I'll give a bit more intuition in a bit. And one of the merits of the geometric algebra is that you can now solve certain geometric questions completely in an algebraic way. And I want to give you an example of that. So say we have two vectors, u and v. We saw in the previous slide that they're in 2D, their wedge product defines an area, u wedge v. Can we now find a w whose area with v is the same as u wedge v, but w is orthogonal to v? And I've made this picture to show what I mean. So we have u and v, and this is their wedge product giving this area. And here I draw minus w because yeah, otherwise it would be on top of this, but yeah, so you can imagine what it means. And we want now to find this w that's orthogonal to v, but the area with v is the same as this parallelogram. Well, the only thing we have to realize is that when w is orthogonal to v, then their inner product is 0. And that means that we can solve the following equation. So we saw that the geometric product of two vectors gives an inner product and an outer product. But the fact that we require w to be orthogonal to v means that its product with v should give nothing but a wedge part. So we should not get this inner product part, it should vanish. It should only give some kind of bivector, this wedge product. And then we have to, and we solve for w. And this wedge product part should be exactly equal to u wedge v. Now, plugging in this u wedge v definition here, as you can see, we get this formula here. And now we just solve for w by applying v inverse on the right. So we get v inverse here, multiplying here on the right with v inverse, it cancels with this v, and we get vuv inverse. Now, you might say, can we invert vectors now? And yes, we can. And it's a simple argument. If we define the multiplicative inverse of v to be v over its squared length, then we get v times v the fundamental axiom was that scale vectors square to their squared length. So we get, the squared length over itself, which gives 1, showing that it's a multiplicative inverse. And so I've now found this vector W in a completely algebraic way, without picking a basis. So this is completely basis independent yet. I haven't specialized to a certain dimension yet. So I've drawn the 2-dimensional case here because it's easy to visualize, but we could be in a 100-dimensional space. I haven't said anything about that yet, or what kind of quadratic form we're using. So we could be Euclidean, but we could also be in some non-definite metric. Okay, so how do we actually make computations? And that's, to do so, we have to pick a basis at some point. So let's start with the vector space R3. It has 3 basis vectors, meaning that we can write any vector in the space as a linear combination of some coefficients multiplied with their basis vectors. And we also know that E1 times E2, so 2 basis vectors, we saw that the geometric product of 2 vectors gives this inner product part and the wedge product part. But we choose the basis vectors to be orthogonal. So the inner product vanishes, meaning that for these basis vectors, their geometric product is equal to the wedge product. This wedge product was now about this area, if you remember, between 2 vectors in the. So what it means is, and we cannot really reduce this wedge product to anything we saw before. So it doesn't reduce to a vector or a scalar. So it's really a new kind of basis object called a basis blade. And the Clifford algebra basis for the 3-dimensional space then looks like this. So we have scalars, we have vectors, that you're used to, but we also have these new basis elements, which are products of vectors. Here are bivectors, and we can also multiply 3 vectors, and together they form a multi-vector basis. Now, because the geometric product of 2 basis vectors is equal to their wedge product, we saw before that the wedge product was anti-commutative. So if we swap the order, we pick up a minus sign. And I'm going to use this now to convince you that this basis is complete. If we take the trivector basis element, E1 to 3, and multiply again with E1 on the right, what we can do is we can swap E through E3, E1. So E1 to 3 is shorthand for E1, E2, E3. We can swap E3, E1 and pick up a minus sign using this relation. Swap E2 and E1 and the minus sign is gone. And now we see that we get E1 squared, which squares to a scalar is the axiom. So we have some scalar times E2, 3, which is again which is now an element that we already had in our basis, this E2, 3. So we've landed back again in the algebra. So after E1, 2, 3, there's nothing more we can do. And that means that any multi-vector can be written as a linear combination of these vectors, bivectors, and trivectors, as shown here, where we have coefficients x12, x13, and so on. Now, you'll also hear me say sometimes vector in the algebra. And what I then mean is that I talk about a multi-vector whose only the vector coefficients are non-zero. So what I mean is you can imagine all these bivector and trivector parts and scalar parts are 0, and only the vector part is non-zero. And moreover, we can really talk about subspaces. So if we write Clifford 0 of this vector space and a certain bilinear or quadratic form, those are only the multivectors where we have scalar, non-zero scalar coefficients. That is just the same as the field that we begin with, the real numbers. Clifford 1, the first grade, are the vectors. Yeah, those are all elements where only the vector part is non-zero. Now, you already heard me say grade. We talk about, so this number here is called the grade. And we have that scalars are the grade 0 parts, vectors are grade 1 parts, bivectors are grade 2 parts. And that's because they are multiplications of the number of times you have to multiply a vector to get to that element. Okay. Now that we have a basis, let's look at what this geometric product that we already discussed looks like in a basis, where we have some coefficients. So we now take two vectors in the algebra, as I discussed before, and assume that the bilinear form or quadratic form is always 0. So Euclidean setting. Two-dimensional algebra. So we have two basis vectors. That means that two vectors A and B in our basis can be written like this. Now, using distributivity of the product, we can multiply the first factor over the second one. And then we can again distribute these two factors. And what we get, what you see here is you get, if we focus in on this product, this B1 is a coefficient. So that can always go in front. And what you then get is E1 squared. So this E1 squared we see here. Similarly for this multiplication here, we get E1, E2. Here we get E2, E1. And here we get E2 squared. So the next line, we can use the fact that the quadratic form gives 1. So we have here a scalar part. And here we had this E1, E2, which was this basis plate. But here we have E2, E1. But using the anti-commutativity rule, we can pick up a minus sign and swap the order. And now we've expressed the geometric product again in the Clifford basis that we defined. And this you can now recognize as an inner product here, which gives the scalar result, and the wedge product, which gives a bivector result. And that's how we do computations in a certain basis. And of course, this then computes, the inner product and wedge product relating to an area. Okay, I'm gonna skip over the applications because of time. So moving on to Clifford group equivariant networks. We have some theoretical results. So we studied this quite fundamentally and looked at this Clifford group. So this Clifford group is a subset of the Clifford algebra, so it contains certain multivectors. And this group has a certain action called the adjusted twisted conjugation. And what we do is we take an element of this Clifford group, and then rho of W defines a map from the Clifford algebra to itself. And in a very special case, if we take W and V to be vectors, then rho of W of V, so vectors in the algebra, so vectors are elements of this Clifford group, then rho of W of V is defined to be minus W V W inverse. And this we defined W or rho really like this because this is a reflection. And there's a famous theorem called Cartan-Dieudonné that says that all orthogonal transformations can be reduced, are compositions of reflections. And so basically the idea behind this Clifford group is that we can start with reflections and start composing more and more reflections. We all put them into this group, and that leads to the orthogonal group. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. And this holds for any dimension or any non-degenerate quadratic form. Now, to give you a bit of intuition there, if we take this duck and we reflect it in this mirror, then we can reflect it again in a mirror. And now we have rotated the duck. So two reflections lead to a rotation around this angle theta. Okay. Now this rho of W, this group action, it satisfies certain nice properties. First, it is additive. So if we take two multivectors and we add them and then apply this group action, that's the same as applying the group action first to both terms and then adding them. Similarly for multiplying, so we can multiply two multivectors, apply the group action, or apply the action to each multivector and then multiply them. And it commutes with scalar multiplication. So we have some scalar and we multiply that with x, then we could take that scalar out. And most importantly, it preserves bilinear forms. So if we rotate a certain multivector and we rotate another multivector and then take their scalar product, that's the same scalar product as the original multivectors. And this was the requirement, as I discussed early on, for orthogonal transformation. So rho always acts as an orthogonal transformation. So we have a representation of the orthogonal group on multivectors. And moreover, if we are equivariant with respect to the Clifford group, we get equivariance with respect to the orthogonal group of rotations and reflections in 3D. Okay, so now that we have this insight, we have to find parameterizations that are equivariant to this action rho.
Can I ask a quick question, David, to summarize? So you mentioned something that every orthogonal transformation decomposes into multiple reflections.
Yeah.
All right. So just to be clear, if I want to represent an orthogonal transformation in this Clifford group, I cannot do that with just one single element of the group or one vector in the Clifford algebra. I have to do this with a sequence of Clifford group elements.
Yes. So up to four dimensions, you can, so including 3, you can directly parameterize orthogonal transformations. You can directly parameterize them or specify them. From there on, you have to take products of, or you have to compose reflections, let's say, to represent them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. But in the duck rotation, you needed 2 of those transformations, right? And not 1.
Yeah, so it was to give some intuition about that theorem. So you can directly represent it, but the way you represent it, this element can also be seen still as a composition of 2 reflections.
Okay, yeah, clear. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we now want a parameterization that is equivariant with respect to this orthogonal or to this Clifford group. And we find that polynomials and grade projections are both two ingredients that we can use. First, let's discuss polynomials. So let's say we have a tuple of multivectors, x1 to xl. Then it turns out that if we take a polynomial in these multivectors, I'll give a bit more intuition in a bit. That is an equivariant map. So meaning that if we apply rho to this polynomial, rho of w to this polynomial, that's the same as taking the polynomial of the rotated, for example, multivectors. Schematically, it's given like this. Now I'll give you an example. We take two multivectors here, and we write down a polynomial up to the second order. So this has a scalar bias term. It has a linear part. So phi here are coefficients. And it has a product part. And these products are geometric products between these multivectors. So we get x1 squared, x2 squared, x1, x2, x2, x1, and so on. You can keep going, of course. Then this is an equivariant map. And we can, of course, learn these coefficients. And that already gives you an indication of how we can start learning or parameterizing certain functions to approximate some kind of other function. And yeah, you could see that this rho of w, it satisfied these nice properties, right? It commuted with scalar multiplication. It was additive and multiplicative. So we can distribute this rho here over this whole sum. We can take out the scalars and we can distribute it also over the products. And then you've basically shown the equivariance. But that's an indication of how you could see that. Next ingredient are grade projections. So we denote a grade projection like this, which is a map from the Clifford again to itself. And it's the projection onto a grade M part. Now, what I mean is that if we take a multivector here expressed in the Clifford basis, and we take the grade 1 part, that means, if you might remember, grade 1 elements are vectors. It simply means take out the grade 1 part, which is a vector. So the result of this projection is just the vector part. Visually, if we have this multivector, we take out the grade 1 part, put the other parts to 0. Similarly, take out the grade 2 part, put the grade 2 are the bivectors, put the other elements to 0. This is also equivariant, meaning that if we take a certain grade, project a certain grade, and then apply the group action, that's the same as going the other way around. And visually, if we apply a group action to a multivector, or select a certain grade, project a certain grade, then that's the same as selecting the grade first and then applying rho of w. I see there's a hand raised.
Yeah, David. I had a quick question trying to sort of wrap my head around this. So
Yeah.
would the polynomials and grade projections encompass pretty much all equivariant operations you can make, or are they more? I guess I'm trying to match this over to, say, SE3 equivariance, where you can always use invariants, and that's always equivariant, right? But if you use tensor products, that's an entire new set of operations you can make that is more, I guess, more rich. So in this case, are sort of the grade projection polynomials a subset of everything that's possible, or do they
Yeah,
cover?
so yeah, we haven't studied this yet. I think there are more operations you could do. So Qualcomm also had a recent paper on using geometric algebra in equivariant deep learning. I think they are also studying now like multilinear maps, equivariant multilinear maps, and they're really trying to find all kind of operations you could do. So I'm not sure yet if this is fully general. Also, we might discuss that later on also, but tensor products are more general, but they also have certain downsides. So if you're used to working with tensor field networks, for example, you have these L equals 1, 2, 3, and higher order tensors. Those you cannot, not all of them you can represent using this framework. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Cool. Okay, so we had these two ingredients, polynomials and grade projections. Now going to our methodology. So we have, I'm going to discuss linear layers and geometric product layers. So a polynomial up to the first order is just a linear combination. That's what we saw in this example polynomial that I showed earlier. So we denote a set of multivectors, x1 to xl. Then we can linearly combine them using a linear combination where I see these x1 to xl as channels, and I let this sum run over these over the channels, and we have some weight here phi that multiplies with those multivectors, and we can repeat those linear combinations for a number of output channels. So you can define kind of a matrix which has number of input channels by number of output channels, and like a fully connected map in your regular neural network. You can you have a linear layer, but now in multivectors. We can go even a step further because we can, since rho, the group action respects these grades, we can have such a matrix for each individual grade. So we can have fully connected layers in the scalars, in the vectors, in the bivectors separately. And that's what's shown here. You could imagine this schematic of neural networks which operate on scalars. You must be familiar with it. But now not each neuron is just a scalar, but a multivector. And we are applying fully connected layers to these multivector grades. Okay, so by linearly...
Can you repeat it? So you were saying that you could also decide the weights to be multivectors instead of scalars? Is that what you said?
No, I'm saying that if we have here on the left, we have here 5 multivectors, then we can take linear combinations of the grades of each of them. So let's say the scalars, and we can operate on we can linearly combine these different grades with each other.
Okay, cool.
Weights.
Yeah, okay. Because if you were to use for phi a learnable multivector, for example, then this would probably break equivariance, I guess, because then you don't have this nice distributive rule and.
Exactly, that's exactly right.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, now linear combinations, they don't mix information between these different grades. So the merit of our method is given by these parameterized geometric products. And to visualize that, I've made this visualization where we have 2 multivectors here on the left, and we want to take their geometric product. The geometric product of 2 multivectors, you can decompose into summations over the products between each 2 separate grades. So what I mean is we can grade project these multivectors on the left onto the vector part. The vector part was grade 1, if you might remember. So we take the geometric product here of 2 vectors. And we've done that in the first few slides. We looked at the geometric product of 2 vectors that gave us a scalar part, which was this inner product between the 2 vectors. So we are now projecting these 2 multivectors onto both their vector parts and looking at the output scalar part. But it also gave this output bivector part, if you might remember. But that is just an example. We can also look at the interaction between a vector and a bivector, as shown here, and among others, that gives us a trivector output. And if we look at all these different kinds of interactions that we can have between these different grades, you get this diagram, which might be a bit overwhelming. But each of these three-way interactions, we can give one weight. And that's shown here. So every combination of green, red, and blue, each of those interactions gets one weight. And we have a double sum over I and j. And that is a way to parameterize geometric products. And then if we look at these x1 to xl different multivectors, then we can have this parameterized geometric products between every ith and jth element. So x1 with x2, x1 with x3, and so on and so forth. And that is the way you can make your data interact and learn how these different multivectors and their individual grades should interact with each other. Okay, so the network architecture is then just a feed-forward network where we have these kind of linear blocks and geometric product blocks. Now, there are also other layers that I didn't discuss here because, for example, this multivector gating, nonlinearity, because they are very familiar to what's already done before this work, kind of these gating nonlinearities. But we could discuss them later on as well. Okay, so
sorry to interrupt, David. I do have a question actually. The geometric product in your neural networks, between what kind of vectors are they happening? Is it between all of the channels? That you need a product of two vectors, right? In the algebra, and yeah, which do you take? If you have 5 channels, then you need 5 by 5 of these products. And if you have more channels, then it will become even more expensive. So I was just wondering, like, between what kind of vectors are these products taken in your networks?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why this will explode indeed. And that's why we also have like, what we, for example, also have is an element-wise geometric product where we take a set of multivectors and use a linear layer to produce another set of multivectors from those. And then we just element-wise do geometric products between them. So we kind of learn how to couple, which one on the left and which one on the right should get a geometric product. And that's a way how we can save some of this efficiency.
Oh, that's nice. It sounds like a geometric vector perceptron, which have you familiar, same kind of concept. Okay, cool. That's nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Okay. So discussing some experiments, in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip over these kind of toy experiments where we look at some toy settings of 5-dimensional settings. This is an experiment that's maybe a bit more interesting because it's a better known data set. So this n-body dynamics. So it's about 5 charged particles, their positions and velocities, and the task is to estimate their positions after 1,000 time steps. And we see that we significantly outperform everything basically that came before SEGNN, which is a paper actually by Eric. And the reason is that SEGNN and this kind of Clifford layers, by the way, we create a graph neural network, basically a simple message passing neural network using these feed-forward networks that I presented before as message and update networks. That's how we create in a simple way, a graph neural network out of this. And SEGNN and our Clifford networks are very much the same in this three-dimensional setting. And still, we get a slight advantage over SEGNN. Another interesting experiment is this 013 experiment. So here we are interested in, so what they do at these particle accelerator facilities like CERN is they accelerate particles close to the speed of light, and then they make them collide. And at collision, there are many short-lived particles that are there for a short moment, and the task is then to identify which kind of particles were there. And top tagging specifically tries to identify whether the collision event produced a top quark. So the idea is we have this collision data, and we want to identify whether there's a top quark or not. So we're given the momenta and energy of 200 particles. So it's a binary classification task. Now, the thing is that these particles are moving at relativistic speeds. So we want to be equivariant. We want to take basically special relativity into account. And therefore, we want to be invariant with respect to Lorentz transformations. The Lorentz group is a subgroup of 013, which, as I discussed in the beginning of the talk, are all linear transformations that preserve the bilinear form given by this metric. And we can simply use the layers that I discussed earlier and swap the metric, the Euclidean metric, for this metric, and we can use the same layers, which was pretty nice. And there's a question by Keith.
Yeah, I guess maybe I could have asked it after this, but I guess my question was on the metric. So how easy is it to swap the metric? Could you use something else other than Minkowski fairly easily?
Yeah, I will show you in a bit. It's in the code demo. It's simply just type it and everything keeps working. Change it by hand and everything keeps working.
So may I ask you a question as well on this? So really this matrix is only used in a product, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, all the algebra is set up, and at some locations you have to take inner products and that's where you apply this matrix.
Yeah, in the beginning of the talk, I started with this inner product, and the whole algebra is defined such that it respects the inner product of the space that you start with. Yeah. Which is in this case this Minkowski space, and everything then beyond that keeps respecting that.
Yeah, I was just thinking, do we also need to pay attention to how we define the basis vectors, or is that always like your canonical basis of ones and zeros in orthogonal directions?
Yeah, I think you can always get away with just the usual canonical basis.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry for the interruption. Yeah.
No worries. Please keep it coming. Okay, so yeah, here we are able to match kind of the state-of-the-art method, which was LorentzNet, which is a method that was specifically designed for this task, which is pretty cool because we use the same layers as before and are able to match the state-of-the-art. Okay, so then concluding, we've presented an equivariant parameterization of neural networks based on Clifford algebras. We studied this Clifford group, which always acts like an orthogonal transformation. We saw that polynomials and their grade projections are Clifford equivariant and therefore orthogonally equivariant. And it gives remarkably versatile models because we can apply them in different dimensions and look at several applications. And despite that, despite the versatility, we were sometimes able to match models that were specifically designed for certain tasks. Now, this comes, of course, at a cost, and that is computational overhead. caused by these geometric product layers, these bilinear geometric product layers. But other steerable methods also suffer from this. And I don't see a reason yet why, this should not in principle be slower computationally than those methods. So to summarize, the advantages or the downside, and in contrast to the downsides of the other flavors of equivariant neural networks that I discussed earlier, we don't need group convolutions. We can work with vector and higher order features like bivectors and so on. And we can generalize to quadratic spaces of any dimension. And so the code is available. Oh, whoops, sorry about this. Code is available online. Paper is available on arXiv. And soon I will release a blog post series where I explain some of these concepts in a bit less mathematical way, let's say, as in the paper. And that concludes my talk. So thanks for listening.
Thank you for the talk, David. I think I want to go back to a comment that you said about in equivariant networks, you have, the L equals 0, 1, 2, 3. And I guess you considered that a disadvantage. I think you touched on that in the last slide. So I guess I'm still trying to figure out what exactly is the disadvantage of having those L equals 0, 1, 2, 3, and then as opposed to sort of using the CG ENN.
Yeah, so those kind of if you want to use those Clebsch-Gordon coefficients, then you have to solve for all the spaces that you want to work in. You have to solve them again. So of course there's this E3NN library where everything is done in 3 dimensions in the Euclidean setting. But if you want to go to 2-dimensional or 4-dimensional, 5-dimensional, or do like projective geometry, conformal geometry, this Minkowski space, then you have to solve those coefficients again. And in our networks, you don't have to do that.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so you answered my follow-up question, which is, aren't the Clebsch-Gordon coefficients solved already? So okay, that's an interesting advantage.
You can also solve them for some of those cases, I think. But yeah, you would have to go through it. Yeah.
Can I ask a question in this direction? So in the Clebsch-Gordon tensor field type networks, those are based on irreducible representations, very much like this canonical basis that you are using, and then defining how they interact with each other. So in this is a geometric product. But in a group convolutional setting in general, we either adopt a regular group convolution viewpoint where we have regular representations acting on these objects, and we have the steerable ones, which decompose into this irreducible acting on these individual components. And I was just wondering, like, are there such theorems or results also available in geometric algebra? Like, are there other bases that are kind of interesting, other than the standard basis that you're working with, that you know of?
No, I'm not sure if I can answer that question right now. There is some there is some analysis as to how this Clifford group, for example, acts on these on the representations, or what kind of representations this Clifford group has when acting on these bivectors and trivectors and so on. I think we don't have all the possible no, I shouldn't start saying things that I'm not sure of. So maybe we can talk about it later.
We can think about it at a later stage, because that's for the group conclusions. I think sometimes it's useful to think in terms of regular representations. Sometimes it's useful in EREPs. And so I just was wondering, okay, maybe there's some room maybe for exploration in the Clifford algebra space for, other useful types of basis functions. I'm not sure about this.
Okay.
I think Leo had some comments on that.
Yeah,
I think
please, but they also.
Yeah, so indeed, we usually use the orthogonal basis, but there's no reason to actually do that because you could use anything. There are some algebras in which there are geometrically significant different bases, like the CGA, in which you can use a basis of planes and spheres, or you can go to a basis that is more representing points at finite and infinite places. And depending on your problem, your puzzle may cast more naturally in one basis than in another, meaning that it uses fewer coefficients. But I wouldn't say that there's a general understanding. Just like David said, things seem to organize in certain patterns, depending on the problem that you apply them to. You can always treat it with the orthogonal basis, but you may sometimes be slightly more efficient by going to a rotated basis, as it were. But we don't know what the general principle is.
Okay, clear. It sounds exciting. Well, all of this actually is. If one question maybe also to David, or actually many, but then I'll leave it maybe to others as well. Like on just more from practical from a practical point of view. So how high do you go in the maximum grade of these methods, and does it really make a difference to go beyond grade 1s or 2s?
Yeah. So the grades are capped by the dimension of the space. So in 3 dimensions, we saw that we went up to a trivector, E1, 2, 3. And then beyond that, you saw that everything basically reduces again to something that we already had. In 4 and higher dimensional spaces, you get also quad vectors and even higher ones depending on the dimensionality of your space. Now, I haven't worked yet with algebras in such dimensions that it makes sense to cap that. But maybe if you really want to work in a high dimensional space, then you would have to cap it at some point to make it tractable. But I don't have experience with that yet.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you.
I think Leo might also have a comment here.
So if you look at the K spaces like 0, 1, and 2, and so on, you can easily imagine what they are. But it turns out that the n minus k spaces are actually the dual representations of these same things. So you are representing planes not by the vectors that are in them, but by their normal vectors. So that means that these very high dimensional things that you think may not be relevant are actually a representation of the dual representation. And you do want those because sometimes it's more easy to represent things in a normal view.
Yeah, so
my internet connection.
Oh, can you still hear me, or was it Leo that?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the algebra has this symmetric kind of the dimensions of each subspace. So the vectors, bivectors, and so on, they are symmetric in the sense that at some point, so the dimensions, the higher you go, it grows, but then at some point it starts become smaller and smaller again up to the pseudoscalar. So the highest grade element is always one-dimensional, and so it has this symmetric structure to it, where you start from scalars and you end it in pseudoscalars. So maybe to add to Leo, it makes sense to actually not incorporate the center grades, because those have the most components, and like Leo said, the n minus k grades, they are dual to the first k grades. So maybe those are actually interesting to keep.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty intuitive explanation. Yeah.
All right, I think if now would be a good time to do the code demo before we.
Yeah. All right. So I prepared two notebooks, but I think we only have time for one, and I think this is the more interesting one to you. So I import these kind of different layers.
Are you sharing at the moment, David? Because I'm not sure if it's just me, but I don't see your screen.
Sorry. All right. Do you see it now?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. So I'm importing here several layers that you find in the code accompanied with the paper. Some of them we discussed. So these kind of geometric product layers, fully connected or steerable geometric product layer. This is this element-wise layer that I talked about to Eric. These linear layers, but then there's also some nonlinearities and layer norms that I didn't discuss, but they're in the paper. And this Clifford Algebra object. So what we can do now is create this algebra object, Clifford Algebra, and specify the metric. So here we are in three-dimensional space, just Euclidean space. And here I sample three vectors, u, v, and w. And what you see here is that each vector has not 3 components, but 8 components. And that's what I meant with vector in the algebra. So we have this scalar part, which is 0. The vector parts are non-zero. And the bivector part and trivector parts are 0. In total, it has shape 8. We can take a geometric product between u and v. And what you see is that the geometric product between two vectors gives this scalar part, which is the inner product, and the bivector part, which whose coefficients are here. We can do these grade projections that I talked about. So we get grade 0 here, which is the scalar part of this UV object given in this line. The vector part, which is now 0, as you see. And the grade 2 is the bivector part, which is this part. If we want to now operate using the Clifford group on these elements, there's this row function that I talked about in the presentation. So u and v are 2 vectors. That's how I sampled them. You might recall that row of 2 vectors was a reflection. So row of u, so this is row of u applied to v. So this reflects v in the plane normal to u. And what you see is you get a new vector out. These scalar parts and bivector parts, they are left 0 because we're reflecting a vector here. Now this is a numerical instability. It's e to the minus 17. So it should actually be 0, but yeah. Now, you can get these other orthogonal transformations by composing reflections. So if we compose 2 reflections, then we can do this u, v, u inverse, but we just do it again with another element. So what we do, and if you then compose 2 reflections, that gives you a rotor, like 2 different reflections, they give a rotation. So this R is defined as U times V, and then which is 2 reflections, and then applying R to W, gives now a rotated version of W, which is still a vector, of course. Now, we can also do that in a batched way. So here I add a batch dimension. I just repeat the same vector twice. That's what you see here. We can take batched geometric products, batched grade projections, batched, this was a reflection, and a batched rotation. Okay, so that gives you some intuition on how to work with the code or with the algebra object. Now, how are we going to do deep learning with this? Let's say we have a molecule, and we have some features of this molecule. So let's say we have charges of 4 atoms. Whoops. Those are 4 scalar elements sampled here, 4 random elements. Let's say we have a one hot representation of some kind of type of this molecule, a categorical variable. That's also an invariant. And this one hot representation we also put as, we also define here. Now we also have maybe 4 positions and 4 momenta of the molecules, yielding 8 vector features. Positions and momenta are vector valued. And those we sample here. Now we add a batch dimension and put them in the correct shape. And what we have here, we have H, which were the scalar features. We have 8 of those. Each is one-dimensional because they are scalars. We also have 8 vector features, which I call X. And those are 3-dimensional because we're in a 3-dimensional space. Now we embed this data in the algebra. And for that, I have this embed grade function. The scalars should go in the scalar part of the multivectors, which is grade 0. And the vectors go into the vector part of the multivector, which is grade 1. Now we concatenate the Clifford embedded features in the first dimension, and we get an input shape of 1, which is the batch size, 16 channels, and the multivector dimension is 8. Now this is very sparse, of course, because we have these scalar features, which are only the 0th grade is non-zero, the rest is all 0. And here we have these vector features where only the vector part of those multivectors is non-zero and the rest is 0. Okay, now to prove to you the equivariance constraint, we sample an element that under rho will apply a reflection, which is a 1-versor or just a vector, as we discussed before. A 2-versor will give us a rotation. This is how we compose those reflections. So a rotor is a composition of 2 reflections or a 2-versor. We get the rotated inputs. So we apply rho of that reflector to the input and rho of that rotor to the input. So we now have reflected and rotated versions of our input. And I proved to you that the norm is preserved, showing that it's an orthogonal transformation. Now we construct some neural network layers. So what I specify here, for example, in this fully connected geometric product layer, I give it the algebra object, number of input features, which was 16, and a number of output features. Now, similarly for these other layers, and now I show you that the equivariance checks out. So we forward the input through this geometric product layer, as well as the reflected input and the rotated input. And now I want to check whether applying reflection and rotation respectively to the original output gives the same as the output of the reflected and rotated inputs respectively. And you see that the assertion checks out, but visually I can show you this. if we apply rho to our input, so an orthogonal transformation, and then apply our layer phi, we get the same as applying our layer phi first, and then applying the rho of W, which is what you see here. These other layers, we get the same. And now we can just mix and match to build our feed-forward neural networks. So here I have just an example of a Clifford MLP. I just defined some of these layers and chain them together, specify the input features, output features, and hidden features, and create this MLP object. And as an output, you see that we now have a densely filled multivectors. And I'm still looking for the best way to parameterize these kind of layers in terms of efficiency and also expressivity. But for inspiration, you can look at the experiment code that is also in the repo. Okay, if we want to now make some vector prediction, then we do algebra get grade 1. So the grade 1 are the vectors, if you remember. So we get the grade of this multi-vector output, which are all these multi-vectors here. We get the grade 1 part, which was the vector part. I print the shape here, and as expected, those are 3-dimensional. Let's say we now have some target vectors that we want to predict. And we just calculate the loss here. And we can backpropagate this. If we want to predict some scalar feature, maybe some probability, if you're doing a classification task, you get the 0th grade, and you and you compare against some scalar features, which are 1-dimensional, and calculate the mean squared error like that. Now we can, and the nice thing now is we can go to 2 dimensions. So what I've done here is I've changed the metric from that 3-dimensional Euclidean metric to a 2-dimensional Euclidean metric. And you see that the code, all the code keeps running apart from the visualization. This is only made for 3 dimensions. But here, all these layers, they keep working, but now in 2-dimensional space. All the equivariance checks out, and we can do our backprop. Now to some crazy 5-dimensional space, where you maybe even have like a 0 vector which squares to 0. So yeah, 5-dimensional space, 2 of them, I don't even know what this means anymore, but everything still works out. We still have orthogonal transformations in this space. We can do our layers work in this space. Equivariance works in this space, and so on. And so for this Minkowski top tagging experiment, all I had to do was make it the correct metric. I think it was something like this, or I think it was here. And yeah, reuse the same layers. And yeah, that's basically the gist of it. And maybe it's a good time to stop here. Do you have questions about this?
Sure, I guess I have a question. So what's the memory footprint of this method? I think you carry a lot of sort of things in the multi-vectors that may or may not be used. Are there like optimizations that can be done there, you think?
Can you repeat the last part, what you said?
Oh, it seems to me like you carry a lot of values in the multi-vectors and in the matrices that I don't think not everything is used. For example, at the end, you just get whatever grade you want, and sometimes it's sparse, sometimes it isn't. Like, are there optimizations that can be done on memory use there, you think?
Yeah, so only the input to our model was sparse, but after the first layer, it will already be dense. So if you remember from this slide where I showed you how these geometric products interact, so very quickly you will fill these bivector and trivector features. So in that sense, it's similar to E3NN memory footprint, where you also define how many vector features do you want, how many scalar features do you want, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Does it blow up in the same way as E3NN, where you keep making higher order features if you don't restrict yourself?
No, so that's the thing. This is restricted. So you don't go higher and higher. So we have a kind of a nicely contained representation of O3 or of ON, where we have these bilinear interactions, which are expressive but don't blow up. It might be a good, in between. And what you can do so indeed, you were right that regarding the output, I just get a certain grade. But what you could do is, for example, take the norm of the grades that you don't use, and somehow you can still, what it comes down to is you can still incorporate that information in your prediction. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
And then so where do we currently stand when it comes to computational time? So you said you had these experiments where you compared SCGNM with an almost identical architecture.
Yeah. So
how does it compare to this?
These layers were slightly slower than SCGNM, but comparable. And I think it's because E3NN is currently very optimized. I think lots of smart people have worked on that library. So, but there's no fundamental difference. Like if you stick to L equals 1 in SCGNN, then computationally, in like theoretical computational time is the same.
Yeah. Okay, cool. No, I'm just wondering, like you mentioned there might be some room for improvement speed-wise. But yeah, it's good to know that they are the same order of complexity, let's say.
Yeah.
So I think we're almost at time. Usually at the very end, I have one question for the session chair. So this one's directed at you, Eric. And David, you can also answer it as well, which is in general, given sort of this talk and the whole field of geometric deep learning, what are some things that you find exciting developments that are happening? What are some unsolved problems that you think people should be working on? And just a general perspective on the field as you see it going forward.
Okay, yeah. So I can start off like, first of all, I think these kind of efforts, I find them super important and very exciting because, with the rise of geometric deep learning, we've been looking for ways of, using deep learning for non-trivial tasks and non-standard data structures, and starting off with these Euclidean symmetries. And now we know very well how to handle SE3 equivariance, for example, and the rotational stuff, how to predict vectors in an equivariant way. And so that already, induced I guess a big leap forward in these computational sciences, work on molecules, computational physics. But still, that was somewhat limited to these particular data structures, and it's always very good to have multiple viewpoints on a problem. And what David here presented was something more general than that, in the sense that you can now address all sorts of symmetries, and vectors, multi-vectors are you encounter them in many applications. So I really expect some nice applications of this as well. And as for geometric deep learning, where I also see some room for open problems or like a space of open problems is a bit more in shape analysis and shape dynamics. Think of conformations of proteins, but also in motion. And I get the feeling that what David presented here today gives us like an excellent starting point to explore these problems as well. And so in general, yeah, I get always very excited when I see these kind of new innovative solutions. So yeah, that's great stuff. Congrats, David, for these results.
Yeah, thanks for the kind words. And yeah, I completely agree. Like, I also want to mention a recent work by Johan Bremer and Pim de Haan from Qualcomm, who did similar, have similar kind of ideas, similar networks, more in a transformer setting, using projective geometry, so the projective geometric algebra. If you're interested, then go check that out. So these kind of different types of geometries can be modeled using this framework. And yeah, like Eric said, I'm very interested in these kinds of physics, relativistic physics applications where, for example, the electromagnetic tensor can be represented as a bivector. And this kind of interesting ideas, how we can represent these kind of, yeah, more advanced objects using Clifford algebras, for example.
That's great. Thank you for your comments. I think I've always been very excited by this geometric deep learning and interested in learning more. So thank you for the great talk. Thank you, Eric, as well, for being our session chair. So just as an update, so next week we have Bob Carpenter from the Flatiron Institute giving his talk on multi-scale generalized Hamiltonian Monte Carlo with delayed rejection. So looking forward to seeing you all there. Thank you, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you. Thank you so much.